For 25 years, Grace Bennett's mornings began with the same quiet rhythm, the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain, the hum of her husband's voice as he stirred his tea. It was a sound that once meant home. Now, it meant habit. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the rim of her mug, eyes unfocused on the window beyond. The morning light spilled in muted gold, touching the dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked. A lawnmower coughed to life. The world was awake. But inside this house, everything felt suspended, like a photograph no one looked at anymore. Daniel scrolled through his phone across the table, his face lit by the screen's cold glow. The toast in the toaster popped. He didn't notice. "Big meeting today?" Grace asked, her voice light, careful, the kind of tone that tests the air before entering it. He nodded without looking up. "Yeah, new client, younger team, fresh energy." Grace smiled faintly. The words landed in her chest like tiny stones. "You've been working with a lot of young people lately." He laughed, not cruelly, but with a sharp edge that carried distance. "That's how it is now, Grace. The world belongs to them." Her eyes lingered on him, on the man who had once shared her late-night ramen noodles in a cheap apartment, who had promised her forever when all they had was each other. His hair was thinner now, his tie looser, but the part of him that used to light up when he saw her had gone dim. Grace lifted her mug, but her tea had gone cold. That night, Daniel came home late. Again. The clock on the wall read 10:47. Grace sat on the couch, pretending to read, though her eyes hadn't moved past the same paragraph for half an hour. She heard the door open, the shuffle of his shoes, the faint scent of rain on his coat, and something else. Perfume, light, floral, not hers. He smiled when he saw her, his expression a mix of fatigue and something unreadable. "You're still up?" She nodded, closing the book that wasn't really open. "Couldn't sleep." He loosened his tie, avoiding her eyes. "Big day tomorrow. We landed the client." "That's great," she said softly. Then, after a beat, "Working late again?" He hesitated, just a flicker, then nodded. "You know how it is." But she didn't, not anymore. When he turned away to hang his jacket, Grace's fingers brushed against the sleeve. The perfume lingered, sweet and young, the kind of scent worn by women who still believed love was effortless. The next few days folded together like pages stuck with rain. Grace moved through them on autopilot, cooking, cleaning, pretending. The rhythm of her life stayed the same, but something beneath it had shifted. Every time Daniel's phone buzzed, he angled the screen away. Every time she asked about his day, his answers grew shorter. Then one morning, while folding laundry, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Lena Hart. A name, a heart. Her breath caught. The message preview glowed like a small, cruel spotlight. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, Danny." Danny. No one had called him that in decades, except her. Grace's hands trembled. The sound of the washing machine filled the silence like a heartbeat. She stared at the phone until it went dark again, then carefully set it back where it was. When Daniel came in moments later, she was stacking clean towels. "You okay?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Just tired." Inside, something cracked. Not loud, not obvious, just a quiet fracture deep enough to change everything. That night, she didn't cry. She just lay awake beside him, watching the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady, peaceful, untouched by guilt. And somewhere between one breath and the next, she realized he was already gone, not in body, but in spirit. The man who used to whisper her name like it mattered had become a stranger sleeping beside her. The next morning, Grace stood before the mirror in the bathroom. The woman staring back had gentle lines at the corners of her eyes, a few silver threads in her dark hair. But her gaze was steady. She wasn't 25 anymore, but she wasn't invisible either. When Daniel came downstairs, briefcase in hand, She asked quietly, "Do you still love me?" He froze, keys in hand. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." He sighed, shoulders tense. "Grace, don't do this now." "I'm late." She nodded, her voice calm. "Then when?" "After you've decided I'm too old to love?" The words hung in the air, sharp, real. He didn't answer, just turned and left, the door closing harder than usual. Grace stood there, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. The same room where laughter once lived now felt like a stranger's house. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, and listened, for the first time in her life, to the silence she'd been avoiding for years. And in that silence, something inside her whispered, "This is not the end." The morning after the dinner silence, Grace woke before the alarm. The house was still, washed in the faint gray of dawn. She lay there for a while, listening to Daniel breathe beside her. Even his sleep sounded restrained, like he was afraid of taking up too much air. She turned to face him, the shape of his shoulders, the thinning hair at his temple, all so familiar yet impossibly far away. She used to trace that line of his neck with her finger after long shifts, whispering things they both meant. Now she couldn't even reach for him without feeling the weight of everything unspoken pressing between them. The alarm buzzed at 6:30. Daniel groaned, rolled over, and hit the snooze button. 5 more minutes, he mumbled. Grace smiled faintly. "You always say that." He didn't reply, just sank deeper into the pillow. Downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Grace had always liked mornings. The quiet, the control. She set 2 mugs on the table, added milk to hers, black for him. She stood there waiting for the sound of his steps on the stairs, but they didn't come. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. When Daniel finally appeared, he was dressed, phone in hand, tie askew. He moved around her like someone in a hurry to leave a crime scene. "Big day?" she asked gently. He looked up, half surprised to hear her voice. "Just the usual." "The usual used to mean you'd tell me about it." He slipped his phone into his pocket. "Grace, please." "Not this morning." Her chest tightened. "When, then?" He took the mug, sipped, then grimaced. "You made it strong." "I didn't change the way I always make it." "Well, maybe my taste changed." The words hung there, heavier than either of them expected. When he left, Grace stood by the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. He didn't glance back. She caught her reflection in the glass, a woman standing in soft light, robe tied loose, holding a coffee cup she didn't want anymore. She had grown used to the rhythm of his absence, the business trips, the late calls, the excuses that had stopped sounding like lies only because she was too tired to question them. That night, when he didn't come home until after midnight, she was still awake, pretending to read. "Sorry," he said softly as he set down his briefcase. "The meeting ran long." She didn't look up. "You said that yesterday." He sighed, loosening his tie. "Grace, I'm not accusing you," she said, eyes fixed on the page. "I'm just trying to remember the last time we talked without it feeling like paperwork." He sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped, watching her. "I don't know when it started, Grace. I just know everything feels heavier now." She looked at him then, really looked. The lines around his eyes, the exhaustion that wasn't just from work. "We used to talk about the future," she said quietly. "Now we just survive the day." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, not out of anger, but out of instinct. "I'll try harder," he said finally. Grace smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You always say that too." At 2 a.m., Grace woke to find his side of the bed empty again. From the hallway, she heard the faint murmur of his voice, low, careful. She crept to the door and paused. "Yeah. No, she's asleep." The whisper came through the crack of light under the study door. Grace stood there, pulse hammering in her throat, and for a long moment she thought about pushing it open, demanding the truth, ending the suspense. But instead, she turned away. Back in bed, she stared at the ceiling until dawn. When the sun finally rose, Daniel was gone. Only his tie lay draped over the chair, a red silk one she'd given him years ago for their anniversary. Grace ran her fingers over it, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer. She didn't cry. Not yet. Because sometimes, the beginning of heartbreak doesn't come with a scream. It comes with a whisper, the sound of a door closing softly behind someone who used to say they loved you. The next morning arrived slow and heavy, like a curtain being drawn open against her will. Grace sat at the kitchen table, chin resting on her hand, staring at the mug Daniel had used the night before. The rim still bore a faint mark of his lips. It felt ridiculous to stare at it, but somehow that tiny trace of him seemed more honest than anything he'd said in months. She rinsed the cup, set it upside down on the drying rack, and let the water run longer than needed. The sound filled the silence that had taken residence in the house. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked unevenly. The place had started to sound different. Not empty exactly, but echoing, like someone had stripped the insulation out of their life. She opened the window. The air outside was cold, crisp with autumn. Daniel had promised they'd take a trip this fall. Just the two of us, somewhere quiet, he'd said in July. But the suitcase still sat in the closet, the tag from last year's vacation still attached. At 9, Grace went through her usual ritual: tidy the counters, feed the cat, check the mail. It was almost mechanical, until her hand froze over a crisp white envelope. No return address, just her name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a hotel receipt. 2 nights. Downtown. Daniel's name printed across the top. The date was last weekend. She stared at it, her pulse thudding in her ears. Room 417. Her first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. The same disbelief you feel when something long suspected finally stands up and introduces itself. Grace placed the paper on the counter. Her reflection on the stainless steel toaster looked like someone else entirely. Someone older, someone exhausted. The cat brushed against her leg and meowed softly. Grace knelt down and whispered, "It's true, isn't it?" I knew, but I didn't want to know. By noon, she was sitting in her car outside the Delmont Hotel. She hadn't planned to drive there. Her body had simply taken her, like muscle memory with a broken compass. She parked, engine idling, watching strangers move in and out of the glass doors, all with somewhere to be, someone to meet. When she finally got out, her legs trembled. Inside, the lobby smelled like citrus and polished marble. A young woman at the desk smiled politely. "Welcome. Do you have a reservation?" Grace hesitated. "No, I'm meeting someone." Her voice cracked just enough to make it sound true. The woman nodded. "Take your time." Grace stepped toward the elevators but stopped halfway. What was she doing? She didn't want to see it. She didn't want confirmation carved into her memory like a scar. She turned back and left. Outside, she stood beneath the overhang as rain began to fall. The sky opened wide and gray, and the first drops hit her face like tiny slaps. She let them. She didn't run. A couple hurried past her, laughing under a shared umbrella. She watched them disappear into a taxi, the man's arm around the woman's waist, the kind of casual intimacy she and Daniel had once had. For a moment she could almost hear it again, the sound of his laughter bouncing off the kitchen walls, the smell of burnt toast, the clatter of spoons, echoes of a life that used to feel like home. That night, Daniel came in late again. She was waiting, not with anger, but with quiet clarity. He hung his jacket without looking at her. "You're still up?" "Yes," she said. "We need to talk." He froze. "Grace, it's past midnight." "Room 417, she said simply. The silence that followed was long and brutal. The sound of the clock ticking in the background felt deafening. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Just the smallest exhale, the sound of defeat. "How long?" she asked. He sat down slowly, like gravity had increased just for him. "It's not what you think." She laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "That's what people say when it's exactly what we think." "I didn't plan for any of this," he said, voice breaking. "I just felt lost." "Lost," she repeated. "And instead of asking me for a map, you found someone else to guide you?" Daniel looked at her, eyes wet. "I never stopped caring about you." Grace nodded, tears burning the corners of her eyes. "But you stopped showing it." She stood, walked past him, and paused at the hallway. "I'm not angry yet," she said, "but I will be. And when I am, I don't think I'll come back from it." That night she slept on the couch. The rain outside didn't stop until morning. She dreamt of a kitchen filled with sunlight, of laughter, of warmth. When she woke, the sun was real, but the warmth was gone. The morning light came in pale and cold, cutting across the living room floor where Grace lay curled on the couch. She hadn't slept much, only drifted in and out like a boat in shallow water. Somewhere around 5 a.m., she heard Daniel stirring upstairs, the sound of the shower running, drawers opening and closing. A normal morning, except it wasn't. Not anymore. When she finally sat up, her body ached in that heavy way grief often hides, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like carrying invisible weight. The smell of coffee drifted down from the kitchen. He'd made a pot. That small gesture almost broke her. They used to fight over who made it first. "Whoever wakes first makes the coffee," she used to say. It had been their quiet little rule, one that somehow felt romantic back then. Now, he stood by the counter, back turned, dressed for work, coffee mug in hand, the shape of an ordinary husband in an extraordinary silence. "Morning," Grace said softly, stepping into the room. He turned. The look on his face wasn't guilt anymore. It was something worse, exhaustion mixed with shame. "Hey," she gestured toward the pot. "You made enough for two? I didn't know if you'd want any." "I don't," she said, sitting down. "But it's nice that you thought to ask." He winced. "Grace!" "Don't," she said quickly. "Don't say my name like that. Like you're sorry. Like you're trying to make it sound smaller." He set his mug down, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," she said. He nodded slowly. "Her name is Rachel." The sound of that name, so ordinary, so human, hit her harder than she expected. She had imagined the other woman 100 different ways, faceless, nameless, a concept more than a person. Now she was real. Grace didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just stared at the small dark stain his mug had left on the counter. "Does she make you happy?" Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation was the answer. Grace stood. "I used to think happiness was something we built together, like a house. But now I see you found a new address." He swallowed hard. "Grace, please don't make this cruel. I never wanted to hurt you." She looked at him then, her voice steady, low, and precise. "You didn't want to hurt me, but you didn't want to stop either. That's not love, Daniel. That's convenience." The air between them thickened. Somewhere outside, a bird called once and went quiet. He moved closer. "We can fix this. Counseling, time, whatever it takes." Grace shook her head. "You're not trying to fix us. You're trying to fix your guilt." For a moment, he said nothing. Then his voice dropped, almost pleading. "You mean everything to me. Then why did you risk losing me?" The question hung there, unanswerable. They stood like that for what felt like forever, the sound of the refrigerator's hum filling the space between their breathing. Grace finally broke the stillness. "Do you remember our first morning here?" He blinked, unsure. "The day we moved in," she said, smiling faintly. "We didn't have a table yet, so we ate breakfast on the floor. You spilled orange juice on the carpet. We laughed for 10 minutes. Daniel's eyes softened. I remember. You said this house would always be our beginning, she whispered. But somewhere along the line, you turned it into an ending. She reached into her robe pocket and placed his tie, the red one she'd folded days ago, on the counter. I think you left this behind on purpose, she said. Maybe it's time I let you take it with you. Daniel's eyes glistened. Are you asking me to leave? Grace nodded once. I'm asking you to be honest enough to go where you already are. He exhaled shakily, pressing his palms to his eyes. For a second, she thought he might refuse, might beg, might say something that could save it all. But instead, he just whispered, I'm sorry, and walked past her toward the door. When it closed, the sound was soft, but final. Grace stood there, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade down the driveway, the world outside moving on as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The kitchen clock ticked twice before she whispered into the empty air, I hope she's worth what we built. Then she picked up her mug, poured herself fresh coffee, and sat alone at the table. The sun had risen fully by then, warm and bright through the window. It glinted off the spoon in her cup, that same tiny sound she'd heard the night before, the one that had started it all. Only now, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded final. The last morning together had come and gone, quietly, just like love sometimes does. Grace didn't open the curtains for 2 days. The house felt cavernous, like an empty museum of their marriage. Coffee rings on the table, the faint indentation of his shoes near the door, the smell of his aftershave lingering on the stairs. Every room carried an echo of what used to be. She moved through it carefully, as if sudden motion might make the memories shatter. At first, she thought she'd cry. A deep, cinematic flood of tears, the kind that releases everything at once. But instead, her grief arrived in smaller ways. The quiet of the evenings, the way her fingers hovered over 2 plates before realizing she only needed one. Even the television betrayed her. Old movies, couples holding hands, laughter that felt cruel. She switched it off and listened to the hum of the fridge, the slow, rhythmic pulse of a life she no longer recognized. On the 3rd morning, she forced herself to open the windows. Cool air swept through, lifting the stale scent of last night's rain. She breathed deeply, arms crossed against the chill. Outside, the neighborhood was still waking up. A jogger with earbuds, a child wobbling on a bicycle, someone's dog barking at nothing in particular. Grace used to know all the neighbors by name. Now she couldn't remember the last time she'd waved to anyone. She stepped outside for the first time in days. The sun was brighter than she expected. Not warm yet, but stubbornly present. The kind that refused to apologize for showing up. Maybe, she thought, that's what I need to do. Later that day, she called Emily. Her daughter's voice came through sleepy and concerned. Mom? Everything okay? I'm fine, Grace said automatically. Then, softer. Well, I will be. A pause. Did you and Dad? It's over, Grace said simply. He left. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that only comes from 2 people realizing a world they both trusted had quietly fallen apart. I'm sorry, Mom, Emily said finally. Grace smiled faintly, even though her throat ached. Don't be. We both saw it coming. I just didn't want to admit it. Do you want me to come by? Grace hesitated. Not yet. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not someone's wife. Emily was quiet, then said softly, You've always been more than that. Grace's eyes filled. Maybe it's time I believe it. That afternoon she took a walk. The park near their house was nearly empty, just a few scattered joggers, a mother pushing a stroller, a teenage boy feeding ducks from a crumpled paper bag. The trees had started to shed their leaves, scattering gold and rust along the path. She found a bench near the pond and sat down. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. She hadn't realized how small her world had become, how her routines had folded in on themselves, shaped entirely around someone else's schedule, someone else's moods. Now, for the first time in decades, There was no one to check in with. No dinner plans, no text saying I'll be late. The quiet was terrifying, but underneath the fear, something else was stirring, the faintest hum of possibility. A man passed by walking his dog. He smiled. Beautiful day, isn't it? Grace blinked, startled by the human contact. It is, she said, then laughed softly. Haven't seen the sun in a while. He chuckled. We all forget to look up sometimes. She nodded, watching as he walked away. Simple words, nothing profound, but they stayed with her. We all forget to look up sometimes. Maybe that was it. Maybe she'd been staring down at the cracks for so long that she'd forgotten the sky was still there. When she returned home, she tidied the kitchen. It wasn't for Daniel this time. It was for her. She scrubbed the counters, rearranged the drawers, threw out the old coffee mugs with faded quotes. When she reached the cupboard where they'd kept the wine glasses, she stopped. One was chipped at the rim, from that night last year when Daniel had dropped it while making her dinner. She almost set it aside, a small relic of something good. But then she caught her reflection in it, distorted, broken at the edge. She dropped it into the trash. The sound of shattering glass was strangely freeing. That evening, she poured herself tea and sat by the window. The sunset painted the sky in streaks of gold and pink, a quiet masterpiece unnoticed by most. She let herself smile, not because she was happy, but because she could feel that she might be again someday. For the first time in weeks, she whispered to herself, "This isn't the end." And for once, she believed it. The first thing Grace noticed when she woke was the light, soft and golden, spilling across the bedroom wall. It looked different now. The light used to fall on 2 pillows. Now it lit only one. She sat up slowly, stretching her arms until her shoulders cracked. No messages, no half-folded shirt tossed over a chair. The absence that once felt unbearable had started to make room for something new. Space. For years, her days had been shaped by Daniel's schedule. Now the hours stretched open, silent and waiting. Grace sipped coffee by the window and looked at the yard. The garden had overgrown, stubborn weeds curling through the flower bed she'd once tended carefully. She'd always meant to replant it, but never had the time. She smiled faintly. Now, time was all she had. That afternoon, she went up to the attic, a place she hadn't stepped into in years. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of cedar. Boxes were stacked like forgotten memories. She pulled one open, old photo albums, a cracked snow globe from their honeymoon, and at the bottom, a framed sketch, her own. A charcoal portrait of a woman's face, unfinished, eyes vivid but mouth blank. Grace touched the smudged corner of the frame. She'd drawn it in college, before Daniel, before the house, before the weight of routine had settled into her bones. She used to love art. The mess of it, the freedom, how time disappeared when her hands were busy creating something. But life, as it often does, had other plans. She leaned against a beam, staring at that sketch for a long time. The woman in the picture looked familiar, haunted, waiting to speak. Maybe it was time to let her. The next day, Grace bought a small sketch pad and a pack of charcoal pencils. The cashier smiled as he scanned them. "Haven't seen these sell much lately," he said. Grace smiled back. "Guess I'm reviving old habits." At home, she cleared the dining table, spread out paper, and stared at the blank page. For a while, nothing happened. Her fingers hesitated, trembling slightly. The silence pressed against her. Then, almost without thinking, she began to draw. Lines took shape, shading, light, breath. The sound of charcoal against paper filled the room, rough, imperfect, alive. She drew until the light faded and her tea went cold. When she finally looked up, there it was, not a masterpiece, not even a complete figure, but something honest. A woman standing in the rain, eyes closed, head tilted up toward the sky. Grace laughed softly. "You finally looked up," she whispered. In the evenings, she started walking again. Not far, just through the park, past the pond where the ducks gathered. Sometimes she'd see the man with the dog again. One evening he stopped. "You've been out here a lot lately," he said kindly. Grace smiled, trying to remember how to breathe. He chuckled. "Doing a good job of it then." They talked for a while. Nothing deep, just small things. The weather, the ducks, the neighborhood bakery that burned its bread every morning but still smelled wonderful. His name was Eli. He was a carpenter, divorced, quiet, kind-eyed. The kind of man who listened when she spoke, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. As they parted, he said, "See you around, Grace." Her name in his voice sounded lighter somehow, not a reminder of who she had been, but a suggestion of who she could still become. Later that night, she hung the unfinished charcoal drawing in the hallway. Just the sketch. No glass, no frame. The paper curled slightly at the edges, imperfect, breathing. It wasn't decoration. It was declaration. When she passed it, she touched the corner gently, leaving a faint smudge, a fingerprint of progress. For the first time in months, Grace felt something close to peace. The silence that used to hurt now felt different, not empty, but open. Before going to bed, she wrote a note on a scrap of paper and pinned it to the refrigerator. What remains isn't the loss. It's what's left after. She stood there for a while, staring at the words, and then smiled. A small, quiet smile that reached her eyes. The empty frame on the attic floor didn't feel like a reminder anymore. It felt like an invitation. The morning began with a familiar sound, the phone ringing, sharp against the quiet house. Grace hesitated before answering. She'd grown used to silence, and sometimes breaking it felt like waking a sleeping bird. "Mom?" It was Emily, her daughter, the voice that always carried a mix of warmth and worry. "Hey, sweetheart," Grace said softly, adjusting the phone against her shoulder. "Everything okay?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Yeah, I just wanted to check on you." Grace smiled faintly. She could hear dishes clattering in the background, a baby's distant cry. Emily's busy life unfolding somewhere far from this still kitchen. "I'm fine, Em. Really." Her daughter didn't sound convinced. "You don't have to be strong for me, Mom." Grace looked around, at the half-finished sketch on the table, the faint sunlight on the floorboards. "I'm not pretending anymore." That's the difference. Emily was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "Dad called me." Grace's fingers froze around her cup. The name hung in the air like a forgotten chord. "Oh?" she said, keeping her voice even. "He said you two talked a while ago." He sounded lost. Grace let out a slow breath. "He made choices. We both did. I'm just learning to live with mine." "Do you hate him?" Emily asked, the question fragile as glass. Grace looked out the window. A leaf fell, spiraling toward the grass. "No," she said finally. "I don't hate him. That would mean I still give him power over me." Emily didn't answer, and for a moment, Grace heard only her own heartbeat. Then Emily said softly, "You sound different, Mom." "I feel different." "Good different?" Grace smiled. "The kind that doesn't need to be good or bad. Just real." Later that afternoon, Grace decided to clean out the study, Daniel's old space. The smell of his cologne still lingered faintly in the air, ghost-like. Books lined the shelves in perfect order, the way he'd always kept them. But the desk, that was hers now. She opened one of the drawers and found an envelope addressed to her in his handwriting. No stamp. Probably written and forgotten in those final months before he left. For a moment, she considered putting it back. Some memories were safer unopened. But then she tore it gently across the seal. The letter was short. A few uneven lines. "Grace, I don't know when things between us became quiet. Maybe we stopped seeing each other the way we used to. I miss the sound of your laugh when you used to sing in the kitchen. I miss the version of me that existed when you still believed in me. I don't know how to fix it anymore. I'm tired of pretending I'm not lost. Daniel." Grace folded the letter carefully and set it down. Her eyes didn't fill with tears this time, only understanding. They'd both been lost long before Lena ever appeared. Sometimes love fades, not from lack of care, but from lack of attention, like a flower left too long in the dark. She slid the letter back into the drawer, not as a wound, but as a memory, a small truth tucked away. That evening, Grace walked to the park again. The air smelled of wet grass and rain. She sat on a bench by the pond, sketchbook in hand, tracing the curve of a willow tree. Eli spotted her from a distance and walked over, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Mind if I sit?" She smiled. "Not at all." He sat beside her, watching the ducks glide over the water. "You always draw nature?" he asked. "Lately, yes. It doesn't talk back," she said, half smiling. He chuckled softly. "Fair point." After a while, he nodded toward her sketch. "You've got a calm hand. That's rare." Grace shrugged. "It's getting steadier." Eli looked at her then, really looked, and said quietly, "You've been through something, haven't you?" She paused, her pencil resting on the page. "Haven't we all?" He smiled gently. "Yeah, but not everyone turns it into art." For a moment they just sat there, two people with quiet scars, no need to explain them. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Eli stood and said, "You ever think about showing your work?" Grace blinked. "You mean like an exhibition?" He nodded. "There's a community art center downtown. They do monthly displays. You should sign up." She laughed softly. "I'm not an artist." He tilted his head. "You're painting your life back together. That counts." For a moment, Grace felt time fold in on itself. Grief, memory, joy, all blending into something almost sacred. She flipped the page and began a new sketch. A small child, mid-laughter, the world blurring around him. The lines came easily, her hand sure and graceful. Eli appeared not long after, a coffee in each hand. "You've officially claimed this bench," he said, sitting down beside her. She accepted the cup, smiling. "Guess I have." "It's quieter here than anywhere else." He nodded, glancing at her sketchbook. "Still drawing?" "Always," she said. "It's how I listen to myself." Eli leaned back, looking at the pond. "You ever think about teaching?" "There's a workshop series starting next month. They need artists to mentor younger ones." Grace blinked. "Me? Teach?" He chuckled. "You say that like it's a foreign word. I wouldn't know where to start." "You start the same way you started painting again, by showing up," he said. "Besides, they could use someone who knows what healing looks like." Grace looked down, considering it. The thought stirred something warm inside her. For so long, her life had been about holding herself together. The idea of helping others do the same. That felt right. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "Good," Eli replied, sipping his coffee. "Thinking about it is how it begins." That evening, Grace received a video call from Emily. Her daughter's face filled the screen, bright, busy, alive. A baby's giggle echoed faintly in the background. "Mom!" Emily beamed. "I saw photos from the gallery online." "You looked amazing." Grace blushed slightly. "You saw those?" "Of course I did." "You're kind of a big deal now." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "Hardly." But hearing her daughter say it made something inside her glow. Then Emily's tone softened. "Dad told me he saw you there." Grace hesitated. "He did. He said you looked peaceful. Happier than he's ever seen you." Grace nodded slowly. "That's probably true." Emily smiled gently. "I'm glad. You deserve that." Grace's throat tightened. "So do you, sweetheart." The baby squealed then, tugging at Emily's hair. They both laughed, and for a moment, Grace just watched. Her daughter's joy, the little hands waving at the screen. Life continuing. After they hung up, Grace sat for a while in the quiet. Then she picked up her brush and began to paint again. This time, it wasn't something planned. Just color. Soft strokes of yellow, pale blue, ivory. Light spilling through shadows. Weeks passed, and the art center became a second home. Grace began volunteering at first, helping arrange supplies, guiding young students as they painted. It started small, one afternoon a week, but soon she was leading her own group. Her students were a mix of teenagers and adults, each carrying invisible weight. Grace never asked what brought them there. She just watched their hands, their silences, their small breakthroughs. "Don't aim for perfect," she'd tell them. "Aim for true." One afternoon, a young woman stayed behind after class. "Ms. Grace," she said quietly, "when you paint, does it make the hurt go away?" Grace thought for a moment. "No," she said. "It just teaches you how to hold it without breaking." The girl nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "That's enough, I think." Grace smiled. "It is." That night, as she locked up the art room, Eli appeared at the doorway. "You're still here," he said, smiling softly. She turned. "Couldn't leave yet. The quiet's nice." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You've changed, Grace." She looked at him, amused. "For better or worse?" "For real," he said. "That's all that matters." They stood there, the air between them charged but calm. No rush, no need for words. Then Eli reached into his pocket and handed her a folded paper. "What's this?" "New art exhibit proposal," he said. "They're calling it Echoes of Light. They want you to be the feature artist." Grace froze. "You're joking." "Do I look like a man who jokes about art?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Eli, I don't know if I'm ready for that." He smiled. "You're more than ready. You've been living your art for years. You just finally started showing it." Grace looked down at the paper in her hands. Her name, written in neat print, beneath the exhibit title. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." That night, she painted again, brighter this time. The colors ran wild across the canvas. Gold, violet, pale rose, everything alive. She stepped back to look at it, her chest full. It wasn't a painting of pain anymore. It was a map of every place she'd been, every piece she'd reclaimed. Grace set her brush down, turned off the light, and stood by the window. Outside, the moon was bright and whole, and for the first time, so was she. The gallery buzzed with a low hum of conversation, a soft current of voices and camera shutters. The sign near the entrance read simply, "Echoes of Light, Works by Grace Marlowe." Her name, glowing in white beneath the exhibit lights, still didn't feel real. It had been months since her first show, months of painting, mentoring, and rediscovering what it meant to belong somewhere again. Tonight, the walls were lined with her journey, pieces that mapped grief, forgiveness, and rediscovery, each one a step out of the dark. Eli walked beside her, calm and proud, his presence quiet but steady. "They're all here because of you," he said softly. Grace shook her head. "No, they're here because they saw themselves in what I made. That's different." Eli smiled. "Exactly. That's what art is." The crowd thinned near the center of the room where her newest piece hung. It was large, sweeping, painted over the course of weeks in her quiet studio. The title card beneath it read, "The Invitation of the Sky." It was unlike anything she'd ever done before. A vast open sky painted in fractured shades of dawn, each color bleeding into the next. At its center, a small silhouette stood on a hill, arms outstretched as if letting go. The edges shimmered faintly with threads of gold, echoes of what remains, but freer now, lighter. A woman nearby whispered, "It feels like breathing after holding your breath too long." Grace heard it, and something in her heart unclenched. Midway through the evening, Emily arrived, radiant in a pale blue dress, holding her baby in one arm. "Mom!" she called, weaving through the small crowd. Grace turned, her breath catching at the sight. Emily hugged her tightly, the baby between them squealing in delight. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace whispered, pulling back to look at her. "You came all this way?" "Wouldn't miss it," Emily said. This is incredible, Mom. I'm so proud of you." Grace smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back. "You sound just like me when you first learned to paint clouds." Emily laughed. "Except yours are way better now." They stood together for a while, looking at the invitation of the sky. Emily said softly, "It feels like you painted freedom." Grace nodded. "Maybe I did." Later, after the guests drifted out and the lights dimmed to a warm amber glow, Eli found her standing before the painting again, lost in thought. He joined her silently. "You know," he said, "the first day I met you, you were afraid of blank pages." Grace smiled faintly. "And now I'm chasing them." "That's the difference between surviving and living," he said. She turned to look at him, his kind eyes, the faint smile that always seemed to reach deeper than words. There was no rush between them, no urgency, just presence, something steady and earned. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You remind me that broken things can shine." Grace felt her throat tighten. "We all can," she said, "if we stop hiding the cracks." He smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them, and for a long moment they simply stood together, the painting glowing softly above them, its sky endless and bright. The next morning, Grace woke early and drove out to the coast, her favorite place from years ago. The air was cool, the sea restless and alive. She carried her sketchbook and thermos of coffee, walking barefoot along the damp sand. The horizon stretched wide before her, soft pinks and silver light, the sea melting into the sky. She sat on a rock, opened her book, and began to draw. Not grief this time, not longing, just motion, waves curling, light touching the surface of the water. And when she finished, she looked down at the page and smiled. No golden lines, no fractures, only the calm fullness of a sky that had nothing left to prove. As she stood, wind in her hair, Grace whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you." Not to Daniel, not to Eli, not even to the world, but to herself. For surviving, for staying, for daring to become. The sea roared softly in reply, and the sunlight broke through the clouds like an answer. She laughed, free, unguarded, and let the sound carry out over the waves. The wind at the coast carried stories that morning. Grace could feel them, in the pull of the tide, in the whistle between the dunes, in the small salt-stung breaths that reached her skin. For years, she'd feared silence. Now, she knew it spoke a language all its own. She stood at the edge of the water, watching a distant sailboat drift along the horizon, its white sail gleaming like a fragment of light. The world, she thought, keeps moving forward, whether or not we're ready. But this time, she was. Back in the city, the art center had begun its summer workshop series. Grace's name now hung on the door of room 3 at the instructor, Grace Marlowe. The language of color, healing through art. The first day, she arrived early, setting out brushes, jars of water, and small blank canvases for her students. Some came in quietly, widows, retirees, a young man who'd lost his father, all strangers bound by the ache of beginning again. Grace smiled at them and said, "We're not here to fix anything. We're here to listen to what the paint has to say." A woman in her 60s raised a trembling hand. "What if what it says hurts?" Grace met her eyes gently. "Then it's probably the truth." There was silence, the good kind, before everyone began to paint. The room soon filled with color, murmurs, and the faint clink of brushes against glass. Grace moved between them, offering quiet encouragement, never correction. She realized something then. This was what her pain had been preparing her for. Not applause, not galleries, but this, connection. That evening, Eli met her outside the art center. The sun was setting, gold spilling across the street. "How was the first class?" he asked, handing her a cup of tea instead of coffee for once. Grace smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It felt like watching people remember how to breathe. He grinned. Sounds like a success. They began walking toward the park, where the pond shimmered in the late light. Ducks glided lazily across the surface. Somewhere, a saxophonist played slow, honeyed notes from a nearby street corner. Grace said quietly, "It's strange. I used to think life was about finding someone to complete you. Now I think it's about finding the parts of yourself you left behind." Eli looked at her, his expression soft. "And when you find them? You don't cling," she said. "You let them fly." The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of lilac and salt, the kind of air that reminded her of both endings and beginnings. They reached the bench, their bench, and sat. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Eli said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Grace turned to him, patient. "I've been offered a position up north," he said, "teaching art therapy at a small college near the coast." Her heart paused, just briefly. "That's wonderful, Eli." He smiled faintly. "It is. But I don't want to leave without asking if you'd come visit, or maybe consider moving eventually." Grace looked out at the pond. The water reflected the sky like glass, pale blue, infinite. A year ago, she would have panicked at the idea of change. Now it felt like another horizon calling. She reached over, resting her hand on his. "Let's see where the wind takes us." Eli's eyes softened. "That's a yes?" "It's a beginning," she said, and for the first time she didn't need to know what came next. A month later, Grace stood at the window of a small coastal cottage, boxes half unpacked, canvases leaning against the walls, a kettle whistling faintly from the kitchen. Eli's laughter drifted from outside. He was teaching a local kid how to sketch waves in charcoal. Grace smiled and turned back to her easel. A blank canvas waited for her, sunlight spilling across it. She dipped her brush into pale gold paint and began to move her hand slowly, deliberately. The rhythm of someone who'd learned the language of wind, of loss, of renewal. Outside, gulls cried overhead, and the ocean breathed in and out, steady and eternal. Grace paused and whispered, almost to herself, "Still here, still painting." She smiled, and the brush moved again. The kitchen was different now. Not by much, the same oak cabinets, the same half-worn rug by the sink. But everything felt lighter. The light through the window carried a warmth she hadn't felt in years, as though the house had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Grace stirred her coffee, the spoon making that familiar soft chime against the ceramic. The sound had haunted her for years, back when it echoed through silence thick with resentment. Now, it was calm, steady. Hers. She had moved through the grief, through the anger, through the hollow months where every noise felt like an accusation. Daniel's absence had once been a wound, but now it was simply a scar, part of her skin, not her soul. The house wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. Eli sat at the counter, scrolling through photos of his college life. He had Daniel's eyes, the same quiet curiosity, but he was lighter, freer somehow. "Mom," he said, glancing up, "you still paint?" Grace smiled, sipping her coffee. "Every day." He nodded, studying her, almost surprised. "You seem happy." She laughed softly. "That's because I am." There was no performance in her voice, no need to convince herself. She had started small, painting again, cooking for one without feeling empty, taking long walks through the park, joining an art class where no one knew her history. It was awkward at first, but she learned how to exist without orbiting someone else's life. Daniel had reached out a few times, tentative, apologetic messages. He was living somewhere up north now, alone. Grace had read his first letter once, cried quietly, and then folded it neatly into a drawer. She didn't hate him. She just didn't belong to him anymore. When she painted now, she didn't think of him at all. The colors were her own. One afternoon, Grace walked through the farmer's market. Fresh apples, wildflowers, people laughing. She caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window. A woman in her late 40s, hair wind-tossed, eyes bright, a tote bag of paints hanging from her shoulder. She didn't look broken. She looked alive. She smiled at her reflection, then turned toward a familiar sound, a musician playing an old jazz tune nearby, the same one she and Daniel used to dance to in the kitchen. For a second, the memory flickered, gentle as candlelight. Grace didn't turn away. She let it play, let it wash through her, soft and sweet. When the song ended, she clapped, dropped a few coins in the musician's case, and kept walking, her steps light, her heart steady. At home that evening, she placed a new canvas on her easel. The first stroke of blue spread across the white like a sunrise. The sound of the spoon in her mug chimed again, bright and rhythmic, not a reminder of the past, but a promise of everything still waiting. Grace smiled. The sound had returned, but this time it was hers. It arrived on a Tuesday. Grace found it wedged between a furniture catalog and a flyer for roof repair, a plain white envelope. Her name written in handwriting she hadn't seen in months, but recognized instantly. Daniel's. For a long moment she simply stared at it. The world around her seemed to hush, the kettle's faint hiss, the whisper of wind outside, the ticking clock, all waiting for her to decide what to do. She sat down at the table, the one they'd bought 25 years ago when they couldn't afford much more than the wood and their laughter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid a butter knife under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No scent of cologne, no embellishment, just words, neat and deliberate. Grace, I've written this letter 100 times and torn it up 100 more. Every version felt wrong, too light or too heavy. I don't know what I'm trying to say that you don't already know, but maybe that's not the point anymore. You were my best friend before you were my wife. You stood beside me when the world was nothing but noise and hope. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the small things, the way your eyes changed in morning light, how you always hummed when you painted. I thought the world owed me more, and in chasing that, I destroyed the only thing that was ever real. I am not asking for forgiveness. You gave me that already, in the quiet way you let me go. What I want is for you to know that you didn't fail. I did. And yet somehow you became stronger for it. I saw your paintings online. Emily sent me one. There's something alive in them, something I never understood when you tried to share it with me. I think I understand now. You were never meant to live in my shadow. You were meant to cast your own light. I'm trying to do the same in my own small ways. Be well, Grace. You were my home once. And though that home is gone, I'm grateful for every room we built together. Daniel. Grace read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't ache. They didn't reopen wounds. They settled, soft, final, like the last page of a book closing gently. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled. For years she'd imagined this moment, some grand apology, some emotional reckoning that would make sense of the past. But this wasn't that. It was quieter, simpler, true. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the drawer where she kept her paints, not to hide it, but to keep it safe among the things that now defined her. Outside, the sky was slipping into dusk, streaks of rose and violet brushing the horizon. Grace walked to the porch, wrapped her cardigan around her shoulders, and watched the world breathe. She thought of Daniel, not with anger, not with love, but with a kind of distant gratitude. They had been two people trying to build something with imperfect hands. It had broken, yes, but it had also built her. Somewhere, she hoped, he'd found peace too. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet grass and lavender. Grace closed her eyes, let the moment wash over her, and smiled. Tomorrow she would start a new canvas, not of the past, but of the sky before her. The gallery smelled faintly of fresh paint, wine, and possibility. Light pooled across polished floors, reflecting off white walls lined with color. her color. Grace stood near the entrance, clutching a glass of water she hadn't touched. Around her, people murmured softly, pausing at each canvas as though standing before pieces of something sacred. Her name, Grace Holloway, was printed neatly on the small white cards beside each painting. Seeing it like that, simple and certain, sent a quiet tremor through her chest. She wasn't the woman who once waited by the window for someone to come home. She wasn't the one who painted secretly at night, afraid her work wasn't good enough to be seen. Tonight, her world was on the walls, the colors of pain and release, love and loneliness, storms and stillness. The first painting drew the most attention, the sound of the spoon. A kitchen bathed in soft morning light, a woman's hand stirring coffee while a window opened to the sea. Viewers lingered there, whispering, drawn by something unspoken, the quiet tension between loss and serenity. Grace had painted it months ago, without realizing it would become the title piece. The act of creation had been instinctive, healing. Tonight, seeing strangers moved by it, she felt both naked and proud. "Your work is remarkable," a voice said beside her. Grace turned. A tall woman with silver hair and kind eyes smiled warmly. She introduced herself as Mara, the gallery owner. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Mara said, her gaze fixed on the painting. "But there's something rare here, not just skill, but truth. You paint silence like it's alive." Grace didn't know what to say. Compliments once made her uncomfortable. Now they simply felt earned. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm. "It's been a long time coming." Mara nodded. "If you have more, I'd love to host a solo show next season. Something tells me this is just the beginning." The words settled over her like sunlight. The beginning. Grace smiled, truly smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. Across the room, Eli waved from the refreshment table, holding up a champagne flute. He looked proud, like a man watching his mother finally become everything she was meant to be. Emily stood beside him, clapping softly, her eyes glistening. Grace excused herself and crossed the room, her dress brushing against the cool tile. "Mom, this is incredible," Eli said. "I can't believe all these people came for you." She laughed, touched his cheek gently. "Neither can I." They walked through the room together, pausing at each canvas. The paintings formed a story, not chronological but emotional. One was all dark tones, heavy brushstrokes, raw pain. Another burst with light, sweeping golds, serene blues, a journey only she could have painted. Later, as the evening thinned and guests drifted out, Grace stood alone in front of her final piece. After the rain, a woman standing beneath a gray sky, hair damp, holding a single rose. Her eyes were not sad, they were alive. Grace traced the air just above the canvas, remembering the night she painted it. The smell of turpentine, the sound of rain against the window, her own heartbeat steady and sure. She whispered, almost to herself, "I made it." Mara appeared behind her again, folding her arms gently. "You did," she said, "and you're not done." Grace smiled, looking around the now quiet gallery. The walls no longer felt foreign. They felt like home. As she turned to leave, she passed by the window, the city lights glittering outside, alive and full of stories she hadn't lived yet. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Outside, she lifted her face to the cool night air. Somewhere, distant jazz music played from a cafe across the street, the same tune she'd heard at the farmer's market months ago. This time, she didn't walk away. She let herself dance. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight spilling across the sheets. No alarm, no rush, just the quiet rhythm of her own breathing and the distant hum of the city waking up beyond the window. For years, mornings had felt like weight, the ache of what she'd lost, the echoes of old promises. But now, they were light, full of stillness and space. She brewed her coffee, poured it into the chipped blue mug she'd kept through every season of her life, and stepped onto the balcony. Below, the street glowed with movement, A bus groaned by. A boy walked a golden retriever. A woman in a red coat laughed into her phone. It was ordinary and perfect. Grace took a slow sip. The air tasted of rain and spring. The gallery opening had changed something in her. Not fame or recognition, but quiet validation. For the first time, she'd shared her truth and found that people saw it. Not as tragedy, but as art. As resilience. She'd spent years waiting for someone else to define her. Now, she defined herself. Later that afternoon, she met Mara for lunch at a small cafe near the harbor. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass, calm and endless. "I've been thinking," Mara said, stirring her tea. "We could feature your next series at the autumn show. Maybe something that builds on this idea of renewal?" Grace smiled. "I think I already started it." "What's it called?" She looked out toward the sea, the sunlight breaking across the waves like liquid silver. "Horizon." Mara's eyes softened. "That's beautiful." Grace nodded. "It's what's left when you stop looking back." They lingered in easy conversation, laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes and the gulls outside. When Mara left, Grace stayed behind, sketchbook open, pencil gliding gently across the page. Lines became light, shapes became possibility. She drew a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, not waiting for rescue, not mourning what was gone, but looking ahead. The sky stretched wide, unfinished, infinite. A voice broke her focus, a soft, friendly tone. "Excuse me, are you Grace Holloway, the artist?" She looked up to find a man standing by her table, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, kind eyes behind thin glasses. He looked nervous but genuine. "I saw your show last night," he said quickly. "Your work moved me. Especially after the rain. It reminded me of my late wife. She used to paint too." Grace smiled, touched. "Thank you, that means more than you know." He hesitated, then gestured toward the empty chair. "Do you mind if I sit?" She nodded. "Please." They talked, about art, about loss, about the strange peace that comes when you stop fighting what can't be changed. His name was Thomas. He was a writer. They didn't exchange numbers. They didn't need to. Sometimes connection didn't have to promise forever. Sometimes it just needed to exist. When he left, Grace walked along the harbor, the sea wind tugging at her scarf. She thought of the word horizon again, that perfect line where the sky met the water, not an ending, not a beginning, just endless continuity. For the first time, she understood that life wasn't about returning to who she'd been, but becoming someone new, someone whole, shaped not by loss, but by survival. That evening, as twilight settled, Grace stood at her easel. She painted without hesitation, without fear of getting it wrong. The canvas filled with soft gold and deep blue, the meeting place of sea and sky. Her brush moved in long, confident strokes. When she stepped back, she saw it, the horizon, stretching forever. Grace smiled. She didn't need anyone to tell her what it meant. She already knew. The sound of the spoon echoed softly from the kitchen again, familiar, steady, alive. This time, it wasn't memory. It was music. 5 years later, the studio smelled of turpentine and sunlight. Grace stood before a group of young artists. 10 students gathered around easels, brushes in hand, their faces glowing with concentration. Outside, morning light filtered through the tall glass windows, scattering rainbows across the floor. "Don't be afraid of the white space," she said, moving between them. "That's where the light breathes. That's where the story waits." The students nodded, dipping brushes into color. Grace paused beside a young woman struggling with a stormy seascape, all dark waves and harsh strokes. "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, "but it's fighting itself. Try letting the water rest for a moment. Let it be still." The woman looked uncertain, then softened her lines. The painting changed instantly. The sea calmed, light crept in. Grace smiled. She saw pieces of her old self in each of them, the doubt, the longing to make something that felt true. and she saw the same spark she'd once been too afraid to claim. After class, she cleaned her brushes, humming softly. A familiar tune drifted through her head, the same old jazz song that had once filled her kitchen all those years ago. Only now, it didn't sting. It shimmered. The studio walls were lined with her own paintings, her life in color. The sound of the spoon, After the Rain, Horizon, and her newest piece, Light Through Glass. In it, a woman stood at a window, sunlight streaming through panes of colored glass. Her face was turned away, but her posture said everything. Not waiting, not searching, simply being. Grace stepped back and studied it. The reflection of her own face shimmered faintly on the glass. Older now, hair streaked with silver, eyes calm. She poured herself a cup of coffee, stirred it absently, listening to the spoon tap against the mug. That familiar, gentle rhythm that had once been a symbol of everything lost. Now it was the heartbeat of a life remade. Outside, Eli's laughter echoed as he arrived with his wife and their new baby. Grace turned, her heart expanding at the sight. She lifted the little girl into her arms, small, warm, alive with wonder. "Hi there," she whispered, smiling. "Welcome to the light." As the baby reached for her necklace, sunlight caught the glass pendant, scattering tiny rainbows across their faces. Grace looked out the window once more, toward the horizon she'd painted so many times. It was no longer something to chase. It simply existed, constant, infinite, and hers. She sipped her coffee, the spoon chiming softly. Life, she realized, had never really been about endings, only transformations. And in the quiet glow of the morning, surrounded by color and laughter and light, Grace finally felt complete.